Hello, welcome to the coffee conversation hosted by the Hugh Gallery on the 2nd of September 2020. My name is Aoife, and it'll be my pleasure today to welcome you all to our talk on a masterpiece by Irish artist Norah McGuinness, her work Garden Green. Norah McGuinness was one of the most important and influential artists in Ireland for much of the 20th century, and it is very hard to overstate how crucial she was in creating the Irish art world as we know it today. I'm going to minimize my little face now so we can focus on the art, but you'll still be able to hear my voice as we take a look at this masterpiece. Garden Green, as I say, is really one of her most spectacular works. The colour is vibrant, the shapes are enticing, and the thing about Norah McGuinness is it is often difficult to be successful as an artist, let alone a designer and organizer as well. But the perfect blend of talents that Norah McGuinness had is what made her one of the most important figures in Irish art. She was the eldest of 5 children, according to Anne Hodge of Nival, who interviewed Norah's sister in 2008. McGuinness often pretended she was 2 years younger than she really was. So for years, many books and articles incorrectly gave her date of birth as 1903 instead of 1901. She seems to actually have adopted the birth year of her sister Charlotte, the next eldest in the family. Her father was a coal merchant and ship owner, and Norah had always hated school. Her father had wanted her to train as a nurse, but it was only after he died, when she was 14 years old, that she was able to attend drawing classes at the local school, Derry Technical School. In 1919, she received a scholarship for the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art, and this became, in many ways, her beginning of her artistic career. She decided early on in her career not to teach, but instead she supported herself through her paintings, through book and magazine illustrations, through stage and costume design, and even through the design of windows in shops. At the Metropolitan School, she studied painting under the artist Patrick Tuohy and design with Harry Clarke, who left the biggest influence on her. In fact, if we see some of her early decorative illustrative works, you can very clearly see the influence of Harry Clarke. It was in fact Clarke who helped her acquire her first ever illustrated commission. She was hired to illustrate A Sentimental Journey through France and Italy by Laurence Sterne. And upon its publishing in 1926, she received great acclaim for the modern approach to illustration and the bold line work she'd given the piece. She also illustrated stories from Frank O'Connor, Maria Edgeworth, Elizabeth Bowen, as well as more work by Laurence Sterne. She married the poet Geoffrey Phibbs in 1924, which gave her an introduction to the Irish literary and theatrical community, including introducing her to W.B. Yeats. Through this, she ended up illustrating the stories of Red Hanrahan and The Secret Rose by W.B. Yeats in 1927. And in turn, Yeats dedicated the opening poem of the work Sailing to Byzantium to Norah. Yeats wanted the book illustrated with Byzantine-style designs, as he attributed great importance to the influence of Byzantine art in Ireland. As a result, it is possible that McGuinness felt somewhat restricted by Yeats's vision. Her illustrations for the work are very stark, simple. They use strong black lines, bold, expressive marks, and ultimately, Yeats was very happy with the work. He thought they were exactly right for the piece he was publishing. And these illustrations gained her even more acclaim by major figures in the Irish art world like Thomas Bodkin, almost ensuring that she was well known almost from the very beginning of her career. Her association with Yeats did not end at simply illustrating his publications. She began her career as a stage designer, designing costumes and decorations for Yeats' play Deirdre in 1926. Her work as a stage designer took her to the Abbey, the early days of the original Peacock Theatre, and then to the Westminster Theatre in London. She designed sets for the first production held in the original Peacock Gallery, and one of the most well-received of her sets were those she designed for the Abbey's first performance of Waiting for Godot. Sadly, as these sets were by their nature temporary, they only existed intact for a few weeks before being dismantled, and they don't survive to this day. In 1929, after the dissolution of her marriage, and with the encouragement of fellow Irish artist Manny Gellett, Norah McGuinness went to Paris to study with the modernist André Lhote. Lhote had been a great influence on Gellett and another artist, Evie Hone, who had worked with him previously. And his approach to art was essentially that of an academic artist with a love of cubism. While in Paris, her style rapidly changed, becoming much freer, much bolder, and more importantly, her colour began to absolutely burst from the canvases with striking vibrancy. She embraced certain cubist elements in her landscape painting, concepts such as fragmentation, multiple viewpoints, and sharp geometric elements in her work, all of which are visible in her piece Garden Green. Over the course of her life, her work remained fundamentally representational, but she still incorporated the influences, the touches of modernism she encountered in Paris, and she began to paint more still lives. Her paintings were quite different to her illustrations, as they were created in strong blocks of tone and colour, seemingly lacking outlines a lot of the time, very different to her very striking graphic work from the beginning of her career. She lived in Paris for 3 years until 1932, then worked in London while also visiting places like India and the Himalayas. She lived for a number of years in London and continued her illustration work, producing designs for Vogue magazine, and she had her first ever one-man show in the Wortham Gallery before she travelled to America in 1937. While living in New York for 2 years, she had exhibitions with the Sullivan Gallery and the Paul Reinhardt Gallery, but one of her most formative experiences in New York would actually happen by accident. One time, in New York, while on a bus, she saw a man being led away by policemen from a department store on Fifth Avenue. It turned out that that was Salvador Dali. He had been invited to design a window display and had created a very surrealist piece that included a fur-lined bat. One customer, however, had complained, and the bat was going to be removed. While it was in the process of being removed, Dali came by to see his window. He ran into the store, horrified that they were taking apart his design, and apparently tried to throw the bathtub either out of the window or at the head of the manager. The reports differ. Instead, while lifting the tub, he stumbled and went straight through the window himself. This dramatic event and the seemingly endless possibilities available for window design inspired Norah McGuinness to try it for herself. While in New York, stores like Lord & Taylor and Altman's used her designs in their windows. She returned eventually to live and work in Ireland in 1939 after the outbreak of the Second World War, where she persuaded Edward Maguire of Brown Thomas to hire her, and she took up window display design at Brown Thomas. Supposedly, her first display literally stopped traffic. Up until that point in time, shopkeepers had simply placed goods in windows with little regard for overall aesthetic and theme. But her new windows were so shocking and eye-catching that they could not help to become one of the centerpieces of the street. She actually ended up working at Brown Thomas for over 20 years, and we can see in these photographs not only one of her completed Brown Thomas window displays, but also her constructing this sort of wire mesh tiger for another window. Norah had a very clear sense of how she wanted to paint from seemingly very early on in her career. Her style never radically changes. Her early work, up until the founding of the Irish Exhibition of Living Art, is a bit more fluid, relaxed than her work from the 40s onwards, which is a little bit stiffer, more sophisticated color tones, and overall perhaps what she is best known for today, like the work Garden Green. However, in spite of this, her style remained always recognizable as work by Norah McGuinness. She never really liked her hometown of Derry, as she felt it had little time for artists. After she divorced her husband, she was invited to a civic reception in Derry, where the mayor's wife made a fuss and complained that a divorced woman shouldn't be allowed to attend. Well, after this event, Norah vowed to never return to Derry. So she bought a home in Rathmullen in Donegal so she could be close, but not in Derry. When a major retrospective exhibition of her work was displayed in Derry years later, she was warmly welcomed and adored, and in her words, they treated her like a prodigal daughter. It wasn't the Derry I knew. By 1950, she and Anna Reid were the first artists to represent Ireland at the Venice Biennale. Her interest in Cubism was renewed in the 1950s after representing Ireland there, and she would end up going on to create works that would earn her many awards and accolades, such as being elected to a member of the Royal Hibernian Academy in 1957, as well as receiving an honorary doctorate from Trinity College in 1973. But in Dublin is where Norah had her biggest impact. In Dublin, McGuinness was part of the circle of artists that included female painters like E.B. Hone, Manny Jellett, Mary Swansea, May Guinness, many of the major figures who were dedicated to the progress and development of art in Ireland. She was one of the first members of the Irish Exhibition of Living Art in 1943, and after Manny Jellett's quite sudden death in 1944, she was elected president of the IELA, a post which she held for almost 30 years. A lot of texts refer to her as a founding member of the Irish Exhibition of Living Art, but according to her, she was not really a founder, instead just a very early member. In spite of this, along with Manny Jellett, Louis Labrocky, and others, she was to help set up the Irish Exhibition of Living Art as a venue for modern art in Ireland, as opposed to the more conservative Royal Hibernian Academy exhibitions. She was regarded as a great organizer, a leader, and a formidable committee woman. Under her leadership, not only did the Irish Exhibition of Living Art flourish as a forum of modern Irish art, it also held exhibitions from international artists like Braque, Picasso, and Jean-Luc Rat. For most of her time as president of the Irish Exhibition of Living Art, it was the only organisation in Ireland committed to modern and avant-garde art. Because of her role as president, she became a major player in the Irish art world. She encouraged and supported many younger Irish artists, and it's been argued that as president of the IELA, she did more for Irish painters than any other artist did. While she was successful as an organizer and designer and leader of exhibitions, painting was her true love. Her colour palette seems to have been influenced by the work of the Fauves, and she shared this really intense love of vibrant colour. She always had a great eye for colour, and as her career went on, she refined her colour sense and became a lot more bold and courageous, until the raw vibrancy of her images becomes one of the most striking features of her work. The colour intensity in her paintings was further enhanced by a trip to India in the 1930s, and from then on her use of sharply contrasting primary colours becomes even more prominent. Much of her very early work, such as those gouache paintings we saw in New York, is done in loose and fluid gouache, and this style does carry on true to her old work, keeping the wide brushstrokes and fluid blocks of colour she so enjoyed. She didn't particularly enjoy pure abstraction, but she did find enjoyment in the simplification of images that came with Cubism. Over time, she developed her own personal, highly recognizable style, foregoing realism for instead building blocks of carefully colored paint to create her images. By the 1930s, she was painting a stark, flattened graphic style. Her subject matter urban, constructed and geometric. But this changed in the 1930s to a more semi-abstract style that had the very intimate subject matter of still life. The lighter palette and looser, softer lines associated with organic forms, different the street scenes and buildings, really gave that much more of a fluid quality to her work. And you can really see the contrasts in color and tone that show the influence of artists like Picasso and Matisse. In the 1950s, her work began to truly simplify, and the landscape became a series of colored blocks which create a pattern on canvas, like we can see in several of these paintings at her retrospective exhibition in 1968. Her individual style was very personal, and the Irish landscape takes on a major role in her work, particularly with her palettes becoming predominantly vibrant greens and browns. From the 1960s onwards, her work seemed to consolidate, to combine that semi-abstract, colourful style of landscape and still life, which it could be argued is best encapsulated in garden green, which you can actually see in the retrospective photograph here. It is just to the right of the centre on the far wall, quite clearly one of her larger works. Garden green combines two of her most common subject matters, the natural world and still life objects. It was gifted to the Hugh Lane Gallery in 1962 by the Contemporary Irish Art Society, and has since become arguably the best known of her still lives. It is ostensibly a still life, She sets it against a window, showing natural flow of the world, allowing it to come in through the open windows to fill up the image. The garden itself is enclosed, it's protected by the physical frame of the window, which we can see carefully encapsulates and contains the abundance of life of the garden. But the cold whites and blue greys of not only the window frame but also many of the still life objects add a sense of a somewhat somber mood to the piece. Her use of light really brings a sort of type of magic to her work. In this piece alone, we can see her great interest in gardening and her love of nature. It was, in fact, one of her great interests. She dedicated herself to her garden in her home on York Road in Dun Laoghaire. She was even a member of the Irish Wildlife Bird Conservatory, and she helped transform the Booterstown Marsh into a bird sanctuary. As a result of this, birds play a large role in many of her landscapes, particularly along the Dublin coastline. Her work seems to depict a world where man and nature co-inhabit and blend together. The mood is always, as I say, created by her color palette, and she really carefully connects different parts of the painting through her use of recurring color. The white, she simplifies forms and perspective until the whole image, while still representational and recognizable, becomes dominated by these sort of blocks of color, as if she's literally constructing it with basic building blocks. You can see it very clearly in the grass towards the upper part of the painting, where it's not actually a whole piece of one color, but instead it's a patchwork quilt, greens of every shade. The white shapes of the painting, seem to create a winding path down the painting, furthering the sense of depth and effortlessly guiding the eye to each corner of the piece. You can see as it starts off with the tablecloth and the bottle moving through the towel across the cup to the lovely white roses, and finally to the child in the background. These white forms are enlivened by these green forms in the painting are enlivened by the pure luminous areas of white that really lead the eye up the picture to the girl in the white dress, actually in the garden. In her later pictures like this, she tends to indicate depth not through traditional perspective, but through, again, facets of paint and color change, as though what we see when we look at her paintings is not a direct realistic image, but instead a result of light refracting through a surface back at us, creating this somewhat deceiving but still recognizable scene. The piece clearly shows her experiences in Paris in the 1930s, studying with André Lhote. You have this really dramatic flattening, particularly in the view, and it makes use of multiple point perspectives, clearly indicating the table, the wine bottles, and the cup, all from different angles, as though she has simultaneously moved around the still life over the course of her painting. She hasn't simply sat herself down in front of an arrangement and painted what she saw. She's experienced it, she's moved around it, she has tried to portray the entirety of the three-dimensional subject matter in using these multiple points of perspective, which, again, it takes away the illusion of realism. It is obviously to viewer's eye not perfectly realistic, but you can still recognize and understand the shapes and forms she is trying to convey. She also enforces all this sense of structure with her strong linear linear elements in the painting, the frame of the window, the door, the table leg, the chair at the front. It's as well as trees in the background, the garden. These straight lines all reinforce the sense of structure, almost if it's holding back the wild colors and vibrancy of the green in the garden. It's said that one of her greatest elements of expression is her color, and I would personally agree with that. That you see in some of her other works how much she enjoys vibrancy of color, how much it becomes one of her main sources of mood, of time, of just expression. The tiny uses of striking bright color capture the eye in almost every single one of her works. Like much of her later work, here in Garden Green, McGuinness has deliberately limited her palette, working almost entirely with those shades of greens and blacks and blues, unlike some of her earlier works where she uses abundance of different types of primary colors. But I would argue that this limiting of the palette actually strengthens the work. It makes it more focused. It gives a sense of harmony and flow to the piece that would be, I think, almost taken away had she included the bright primary colors we see in some of her other works. This green she uses not only represents the natural beauty of Ireland, famous for its supposedly 40 shades of green, but you have the brightness and strength of the color that subconsciously suggests the warmth of sunlight, evoking the feeling of summer. We look at this painting, we see those vibrancies of green, and you would never think this is a dull, rainy winter's day. No, you can feel the heat, you can feel the brightness reflecting from the garden back to us, the viewer. You also have these quite strange, precariously perched elements, such as the spoon, which almost looks like it's going to fall off. But the use of ordinary objects in melodramatic atmospheres actually was one of the distinguishing features of her paintings. She liked to use ordinary items to ground otherwise wild pieces, reminding us that this is not the work of a great French artist lost in the wild forests of Fontainebleau or the wilderness of Provence. Instead, this is made by someone who is deeply enriched with the seeming banalities of ordinary Irish life. She's not a traditional Irish landscape painter, but her painterly style evokes an atmosphere that stays with the viewer far more effectively, I believe, than any romantic or nostalgic piece of the west of Ireland. Her work is always alive, and it is through this liveliness that it captures the true Irishness of her landscapes. Her work has been referred to expressions of painting for living's sake. And I really feel that comes across very well in works like Garden Green. You feel a sense of life, of energy in her work. She doesn't try to represent realistic forms as literal depictions of reality. Rather, she uses the simplified decorative shapes that she had used at the beginning of her career, that she studied in Paris, that she used in her window design, and she allows them to take the place as signifiers of real-life objects and people. As I said, this is only a single painting by Norah McGuinness, but her work, her influence, her role in Irish art became one of the real dominating factors in the development of the Irish art world as we know it today. Her legacy isn't just this wonderfully gifted artist, but as a leader in the development of modern Irish art, who paved the way for many of the great 20th century Irish painters. So, folks, I'm gonna leave it there, but I hope you enjoyed our little discussion about Norah McGuinness and her work Garden Green. If you would like to find any more details about the Hugh Gallery programs, please visit our website, and I hope to talk to you soon in future conversations. Have a great day!